It's almost a rite of passage that every gamer has to spend at least a couple years of their life playing an MMORPG, and it's kind of hard to explain why, especially to those outside the genre who simply can't understand how you can spend hours doing the same things over and over again. The simple explanation, that the MMO offers long-term goals with incremental progress that encourages social play and teamwork, while true, doesn't really address why people play or what they find interesting and compelling enough about them to play for years. And while the individual reason a person plays an MMO, or any game for that matter, will be unique to that player of course, I'd argue that what draws a lot of people to the MMORPG is the idea of potential. The ability to start from nothing and do anything or be anything within a virtual world. Games often tout their open-endedness or player-driven this or that, but the fact of the matter is that the majority of games by design are very rigidly structured, effectively on rails, requiring a very specific set of actions from the player in order for it to move forward. On some level, you're just doing what's expected of you, following the rules, going through the motions, which is fortunately something I and almost every other player can ignore when we play games. It does, however, cast the freedom that the MMO affords the player in a much more impressive light when considered in that context. The MMO doesn't expect anything from you. It doesn't expect you to reach max level, it doesn't expect you to care about the story, it doesn't even expect you to engage with or understand its mechanics. It simply drops you into the world and leaves you to your own devices, trusting you to find meaning in whatever it is you do there. Whether it's mining, manufacturing, socializing, exploring, making money, or simply looking wicked cool. It's not for everybody certainly, but it's a freedom that no other genre can match, and it is compelling for a lot of players. Although today there are almost certainly MMOs that can better highlight the idea of limitless, unbridled potential, the game that does it for me is Ragnarok Online. Released in the States in 2003 and led by none other than the father of the Korean MMORPG Kim Ha-kyu, Ragnarok Online's claim to fame is an expansive class system with a surprising amount of variety and some genuinely open-ended gameplay where you have the freedom, both in standard gameplay and on a more nuanced level, to come up with your own goals. Which is what made the game interesting, unique, and successful both in Korea and eventually worldwide. But it's only part of what makes it special. To me specifically, but I'd argue the MMO genre as well, because of the subtle minutiae that, when combined, enrich the experience. Which is what this video is about. The little things that made, and arguably still make RO special, almost 15 years later. If you have even a passing knowledge of Norse mythology, you know from the title of the game alone that Ragnarok at least draws on it. And it does. But it's not a routine, by-the-numbers story drawing on Norse myth, where Thor and Loki are quest-givers, and we craft the chain that holds Fenrir and fish for Jormungandr, for example. The overarching narrative of Ragnarok is actually pretty subtle, and I've seen dozens of people, and even reviews of the game, insist that it doesn't even have a story. And I can't really fault them for that, because in my experience narrative isn't something that a lot of MMO players pay attention to. They're typically more interested in grinding for the gears and the loots and the experience. But what makes RO really interesting is that it uses this fact, that you probably don't actually care about the story, as part of its narrative. As the storyline section of the official site says, the world is in a shoddy state because people have become complacent, selfish, greedy, and you and your characters are really no different, because once the game starts, the overarching story takes a back seat, and it becomes your story. The time you found that card after weeks of hunting, the parties with friends you still have nearly 15 years later, and the clutch victories in PvP and WoW. You too become complacent, more interested in your own story than that of the world that's quite literally crumbling around you. The main story of Ragnarok is really quite grim, and with each episode it gets even darker. From the deals with demons that destroyed Glasstime, to the corruption of the scientist Vesper and the founding of Uno, to the impending war between Rune Midgard, the Schwarzwald Republic, and Aruna Fels. King Tristan of Rune Midgard and his 3 sons have all been murdered, and the insidious Reckenberg Corporation is pulling the strings behind events like the Somatology Labs, Thanatos Towers restoration, and Satan Morok's awakening. Simply put, Ragnarok is the story of, well, Ragnarok. The end of the world in Norse mythology. But again, it's told in a unique and interesting way. We don't see the death of Baldur or any of the other foretold events of Ragnarok. RO is the story of Ragnarok only as it occurs in Midgard, the realm of humans, which is something we don't really get with the poetic or prose Eddas. Only a handful of lines about how people break the bonds of kinship, become self-centered and miserly, or slip into a profound state of nihilism. RO not only portrays how all that might look, but also provides an in-game explanation for the players who don't care about the story, or are too swept up in their own stories to care about anything else. Which, while it might not be a selling point, you have to admit, is pretty freaking cool. In fact, one of the only times we ever transcend realms and meet an actual divine being is during the aptly named Transcendent quest, which is another tremendously clever bit that manages to subvert one of the more egregious MMO cliches. It goes like this. Chosen heroes will be led to Valhalla, where they'll be reborn as even greater heroes that can protect the world from danger. The Valkyries see the shoddy state of Midgard as a harbinger of Ragnarok and see your max level character as a hero worthy of entering Valhalla. This might sound familiar, the old chosen one cliche, but what's noteworthy about RO is that you don't start out as a hero. You're just some joker who has to work his or her way up from a cotton shirt and 3-slotted knife to someone who is worthy of being recognized by the gods. And interestingly enough, this actually parallels the mythology. The Einherjar were those selected to come to Valhalla and await Ragnarok, but only after they'd proved themselves and been killed in battle. What's also worth noting is that in the mythology the Einherjar are an army, so the end game, the crowning achievement of RO, is to join this group of heroes. It's very simple, but it's the only MMO I've seen that's managed to not only contextualize the idea that your character is a hero, but just one among tens of thousands of others who have that same distinction, but also contextualize it within the narrative. RO doesn't use the material it draws on lightly, but takes a small, very briefly discussed aspect of it and explores it, rather than simply use it for flavor the way some games do. All of this is to say that there's a lot more going on with RO's story than people give it credit for. Let's talk about quests for a bit, because I feel the term quest has become a bit of a misnomer. The dictionary definition of quest is a long or arduous search for something, and I know a quest when I see one. The things going on in the Zelda games? Quests. Shadow of the Colossus? Quest. Tales of Symphonia? Quest. Collecting herbs for Granny's stew or killing 10 fuzzy whatsits are not quests. These are chores, or tasks at best, but I digress. As important as these quests are to your progression through the game, they're not designed to be a significant or memorable part of your experience. They're consumed and promptly forgotten. The quests in RO, on the other hand, are quite different. They're a legitimate chunk of content, challenging, engaging, and of course rewarding content. The Kiyohiri quest, for example, has a little over 70 steps. And while that sounds absolutely dreadful, once you get into it, what step you're on is the last thing on your mind. It has everything you could want from a proper quest in any other game. A clear narrative, likable characters, genuine intrigue, interesting developments, twists, answers. It signposts itself well enough that you don't need to keep tabbing out to a wiki, and it's surprisingly cheap as far as items are concerned for both the amount of quest you get as well as the rewards at the end. RO even has a properly epic quest in the literary sense of the term with the Sign quest. We have a hero, a grand setting, deeds of valor and courage, and interactions with the divine. For better or worse, I guarantee you that anyone who has actually completed the Sign quest remembers it to this day, because it can potentially take weeks to complete as it requires an absolute slew of items, talking to NPCs at certain times of the day, dancing, breaking seals, and of course traveling across the world. But when you complete it, you feel like you've really accomplished something, not to mention that you have something nice to show for it. A status symbol, if you will. But while the quests are rewarding in and of themselves, they also serve a greater narrative purpose. While they do give experience, rather than a reliable way to level up your characters, the quests in RO exist to flesh out the world and the environments in which you level. If the overarching story of RO is of the inexorable march toward the end times on a global level, then the quests focus on the individual struggles and hardships that the people face, and sometimes show just how seedy this world really is. Lighthausen, for example, has recently become a fabulously wealthy city due to the Ragnarok Corporation selling off their technology. The friendship quest, however, focuses on a pair of friends driven apart by the tremendous gap between rich and poor that sprung up as a result of that economic boom. Rachel is a beautiful, serene city and hands down my favorite one in the game, but beneath that lovely exterior lies an oppressive caste system that's put considerable strain on the relationship at the center of the Lost Child quest, resulting in the titular Lost Child absolutely despising his father. You won't find fetch or kill quests here. Instead, the quests involve you uncovering secrets, learning the truth, or solving actual problems. Or perhaps not. You don't abolish the caste system at the end of the Lost Child quest, and you don't help the friends in Lighthausen reconcile either, as one of them gets killed before they can meet up. Sometimes it's simply out of your hands. You can't solve the problem. And what's actually kind of unique is that the characters don't really expect you to either. Because again, you're not a hero. You're just an adventurer who stumbled in there probably looking for the item shop. Some maps even make use of environmental storytelling, hinting at a larger story that may or may not be explored in the quests. The Somatology labs and the Rachel Sanctuary are good examples of this. The fact that the monsters in the labs look an awful lot like player characters and are dropping research charts and handcuffs that still smell faintly of blood ought to pique your interest. The same goes for the monsters in the Rachel Sanctuary that look just like the devotees we see throughout Rachel, only here they're attacking you. And then there's this thing. What on earth is going on down here? And the best part? The quests are completely optional. If you don't fancy the idea of spending several hours clicking through dialogue boxes, that's completely fine. But if you do have a bit of time to farm up some items and don't mind a bit of reading, you're rewarded with some pretty great stories that not only compensate the player suitably for their investment, but tie into the overarching story as well in a way that few MMOs have managed to do. The classes in RO have very clearly defined tank, support, and DPS roles, which reflects the old-school MMO mentality of building and maintaining a community as it encourages specialization, which ultimately fosters cooperation. When I first played RO, there came a point where it would take me hours to get any experience leveling my wizard by myself. But rather than whine about it on message boards, it forced me to seek out people who played tank and support classes so we could party up and take on more difficult dungeons, earning considerably more experience than we would each leveling individually. What makes party play appealing is that every class is really good at something. Support classes in this game, for example, are extremely powerful. Acolyte buffs provided you with plus 10 to strength, dexterity, and intelligence, and 12 to agility. Considering that the stat cap is 99, this is a huge buff. And it's not just the acolytes that are borderline overpowered. My favorite class is the Scholar, which, if you opt for the largely PvP-focused support build, can't kill anything by itself, but can disable and shut down any other class in the game. They're super strong. The benefit to having such powerful classes in the game is that they're absolutely necessary for serious party play, again emphasizing cooperation and community, as opposed to post-WoW MMOs, which are typically more geared towards a solo experience, where party play is beneficial but not practically necessary, which, if you ask me, defeats the purpose of the MMORPG. Why bother playing with other people? Why bother with the whole massively multiplayer bit when I can do virtually everything by myself? But while the classes in RO do have clearly defined roles, they still manage to give the player options and allow for a level of customization with their skills. While there were dozens of wizards running around, any given one had, to some extent, their own unique set of skills, and most importantly, was limited to 2 at most of their trademark AoE skills, due to prerequisites and most wizards taking at least a couple of support skills. Any wizard worth their salt would take Stormgust, but the second was largely up to that player. It depended on which classes they could consistently party with and what they ultimately intended to do with the wizard, whether it was to participate in guild wars or simply get to max level as quickly as possible. And while this certainly makes RO somewhat unique, What I find most interesting about RO's classes is that each one of them has a role not only in the game, but in the world as well, which is evident even in the way they're referred to in the game, not with an abstraction like classes, but as jobs. The first job training quests illustrate this particularly well. I don't know that many people ever did them, but they're some of my favorite quests in the game, because they give the player an idea of how their job is supposed to work in the game world. The Acolyte quest, for example, has you killing undead monsters terrorizing one of the cities, curing people of curses, and delivering mail. The Mage quest has you following the trail of a murder the Thieves Guild can't figure out. The only way you manage to pull it off is through your intelligence. And the Merchant quest has you hunting for the best deal on potions in the main city, while other merchants try to overcharge you or outright swindle you. These entry-level quests showcase a sort of day in the life of your class and serve as a way to orient and immerse the player in their chosen class, which I've found curiously absent from every other MMO I've tried. And it's not just the first jobs that get this special treatment. Second classes get it too with the job change quests. While the job changes all follow the same basic structure, questions, combat, etc., the content for each is profoundly different and serves to show you what your chosen job is all about, not only mechanically, as is illustrated in the Assassin job change, which involves you sneaking around and picking targets out of crowds, which is exactly what you'll be doing in WoW, but also fills you in on that job's role in the world as well. The Sage job change, for example, has you enroll in the actual Sage Academy in features the most difficult, obscure, erudite set of questions in the game, and has you write a thesis at the end of it all. And because the Sage is primarily a support class, the Sage's combat test is kind of a joke, as opposed to the Wizard's combat test, which is hard as nails. Even jobs that got added in later episodes, like ninjas and gunslingers, still had some bearing in the game world. Gunslingers changed class in the industrial center of the Schwarzwald Republic, Einbrock, and ninjas in the Japanese-inspired city Amatsu. Everything made sense in the world. To contrast with this more holistic approach, my character in Tree of Savior is a Psychokino, and while I understand my role in a mechanical sense, I don't really know what my role in the world is. I don't know what a Psychokino is, or what it means to be one in this world. How do people treat Psychokinos? Are they respected? Feared? Ignored? The difference with Ragnarok is that I know that my knight is a tank, a puller, crowd control in WoW, but I also know that he's a member of the Prontera Chivalry, who my lord is, and even the characters who knighted me. It opens up the opportunity for actual roleplay, as you'd expect to find in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. I don't know that anyone ever did, at least on my server, but the thing is that I absolutely could, which is something I can't say for any other MMO I've tried. Music is incredibly subjective, but no discussion of RO would be complete without mentioning the soundtrack, and that's because it's incredible. Just listen to this. At least part of the reason that the music in RO is so revered in online polls and discussions of video game music is because the soundtrack in RO does a remarkable job of conveying a sense of place. I won't say that they all manage to nail this. Rose of Sharon, for example, is a bit too cool for the Vanes fields, but generally there are three types of music in the game. There's the town music, which is usually characterized by clear, serene melodies on soft, soothing instruments like woodwinds, or as in the theme of Aldebaran in the background, sometimes a guitar, and very little percussion. They're often down-tempo and structured very predictably, resulting in comforting, idyllic, memorable tracks. The town music is distinct from field music, which is the most varied of the three types. Like the town music, they're generally very clear and hummable, but differ in the instrumentation, which is usually made up of synths that sometimes emulate actual instruments. The distinguishing feature, however, is that they're much more improvisational. With the field music, it's less a structured melody and more a continuous progression of song. To illustrate this for those of you who have played the game and know the music, you probably know exactly how Unisong goes, but can't recall a specific structure or melody to it. As in Top Hoppy in the background, many of the field tracks are lighthearted and whimsical, and they're typically the only songs that incorporate vocals of any description. Field music is of course distinct from the last type of music, dungeon music. which is characterized by much heavier percussion and often deliberately unnatural sounds. It's here that the influences of the electronic and metal genres are clearly felt. The structure of these songs is thoroughly unpredictable, even jarring at times. In the background you're hearing Angelica, one of the tracks from the higher levels of Thanatos Tower, which switches gears 5 times in its first minute, with each transition layering on new instruments or vocals that may or may not return later in the song. The thing about dungeon music is that there's an audible threat to the music, which isn't the case with the town or field music. This stuff is high energy, aggressive, and intimidating, and it only got more creative and interesting as it went on. The music in Thor's Volcano, for example, is a pseudo-industrial symphony in which the sounds of machinery act as percussion that carries the song with vague melodies overlaid, resulting in an eerie tune that actually fits in with the lore of the place as a secret production and storage area for the warmongering religious zealots of Rachel as well. It's brilliant stuff. But to really illustrate just how incredible RO's music is at conveying a sense of place, let's take a close look at the music from a dungeon in both Ragnarok Online and Tree of Savior. The Paon Cave is likely the first dungeon the player will encounter in RO, and it uses a track that's found nowhere else in the game. As far as its instrumentation is concerned, we have a very clear wood flute, some type of zither or other plucked string instrument, and moderate percussion. Instrumentation that's easy to imagine being commonplace in Paon, a fairly large town surrounded by forests. As for an overall tone, I'd say it's relaxing, but also a bit mysterious, fitting for your first dungeon. In keeping with the idea of this being your first dungeon, the song even sort of eases you into it through the music. There's a very clear, very distinct melody on the flute at the start of the song, but the melody isn't repeated, and as the song continues it becomes more improvisational, characteristic of the field music, but relies more on the percussion to carry it, which is typical of the dungeon music. Finally, the liberal use of echo throughout the song makes it sound like, well, a cave. And the music carries this same sense of place throughout the dungeon. The considerably more difficult 4th and 5th levels of Paon Cave use another unique track that utilizes much heavier and more unnatural percussion as the basis for the song. There's an urgency and intensity to the track that reflects the more dangerous environment and is more in line with how I initially described dungeon music. However, we still know exactly where we are thanks to the instrumentation. The initial sustained flute note harkens back to the flute in the song on the lower levels, the bridge sees the return of the zither, and the echo is still quite prominent. The music throughout Paon Cave makes it very clear that this is not only unmistakably a dungeon, but a quintessentially Paon dungeon. Tree of Savior's Cathedral dungeon is a mid-game dungeon that uses what's probably my favorite song in the game as one of its 3 potential background tracks. It's a sort of electro-classical fusion with the thumping beat and the prominent violin. It's very upbeat and I think it's a genuinely cool song, but it doesn't really tell me anything. It's very repetitive, from the beat, to the melody on the violin, to the lyrics. You could say that the repetitiveness reflects the content of the game the way it does in Hotline Miami, and that's fair enough, but the same could be said for just about every other song in the game as well. It simply doesn't communicate the way the music in RO does. It doesn't differentiate itself as being dungeon music, as it sounds like virtually every other song in the game. The instruments don't really evoke a ruined cathedral, especially the wailing guitar that comes in at around 3 minutes, and the lyrics don't mean anything to me or tell me anything about what's going on in this particular location. Despite the fact that Pristine is a unique track and is only heard on 3 maps in the entire game, it doesn't feel like it was written specifically for this location. It could be literally anywhere else in the game and it would fit just as well. This idea of the music mirroring a setting isn't as uncommon as you might think. I'd argue that most well-loved pieces of video game music have this quality to such a degree that even if you don't have the nostalgia for these locations, they still convey the feelings and emotions meant to be associated with them. Chemical Plant Zone's theme is industrial, aggressive, harsh, and it never lets up. Corridors of Time is ethereal, otherworldly, and magical, with a hint of melancholy. And the instrumentation in Wind Waker's theme is quintessential sailing song. It wouldn't fit on the title screen of any other Zelda game. Try it with your friends, play them a song from a game you've played and ask them what they associate with the music. You might be surprised at just how accurate they are. Good video game music evokes an emotional response to be associated specifically with a setting. RO's music fits that bill as well, and it's probably the reason I have around 40 songs from the RO soundtrack I still listen to on a fairly regular basis, and only 6 from the TOS one. I don't say all of this to pick on Tree of Savior, or begrudge it because it's not enough like RO. I simply use it as an example of the modern MMO, which is often a sort of treadmill experience where the player is pulled through the game and the maps and the quests in a very clinical way. It's all planned meticulously from start to finish. The kind of game where leveling a knight is exactly the same as leveling a wizard. The kind of game where it's not the journey that matters, just the destination at the end. And that's not RO to me. My experience with RO and the way I play it is vastly different from the next person, because the way you play RO is ultimately up to you. Whether you enjoy the massive scale PvP battles of WoW, the strategy and coordination required to take down a tough boss flawlessly, or simply grouping up with friends to tackle a difficult dungeon. My problem isn't with Tree of Savior. What I take issue with is the term spiritual successor, and not just in reference to RO, but in general. It's a term that can be slapped on to just about anything as long as it has a few similarities, which is frankly ridiculous. As I hope this video has illustrated, what makes a game special or memorable to someone is entirely subjective. For me, it takes more than a charming art style and a narrative loosely based on some obscure mythology to really claim to be a spiritual successor to Ragnarok. And the same goes for every player. What spiritual successor means to you likely isn't what it means to the next guy, which makes spiritual successor as a term used to describe a game effectively useless, especially with how liberally it's used in modern games discourse. All of this is to say that we as a community should be careful, or at the very least more specific, about the way we discuss games. Because in the case of Tree of Savior, IMC Games isn't at fault for all the talk of spiritual successors. They never claimed Tree of Savior was a spiritual successor to RO, and in fact seemed to deliberately avoid even mentioning the game in any of their press releases or interactions with the community. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a developer market a game as a spiritual successor to anything. It's usually a tribute to, or inspired by, which promises a great deal less than what spiritual successor ought to imply. When I hear spiritual successor, I think of a game like Bloodborne. Not a game that carries on in spirit, which means absolutely nothing, but a game that captures the spirit of the game it's succeeding and then does more with it. With Bloodborne, it's not just a couple of similarities that link it to Demons and Dark Souls, but the entire experience. The gameplay, the difficulty, even down to the way the narrative is conveyed to the player. At the same time though, it's very much its own game. It's not trying to be Demons or Dark Souls for the sake of nostalgia. It's a completely new experience that explores new themes and ideas, makes great strides forward in terms of consistency from Dark Souls, and coaxes players familiar with the Souls games well out of their comfort zones, forcing them to play in new and exciting ways. Like the rest of the Souls games, Bloodborne is an expertly crafted experience, but it also takes a lot of risks, and I think the medium is better for it. And by that definition, there are precious few games that can claim to be spiritual successors. Ultimately, spiritual successor is a term that, in current games discourse, has effectively lost its meaning, because so many people have different ideas as to what it means. And as far as I'm concerned, it belongs only in clickbait titles that shouldn't be taken seriously, like that of this video for example. It's a term that, if you ask me, is better off retired. More videos are coming soon, so subscribe to stay updated. But until then, why not check out my take on the significance of the many Buddhist parallels in Suda51's Killer 7, or why I think Might and Delight's Shelter is hands down the best dad game out there.